You think a restaurant chain dies from bad food or bad management? Chi-Chi's died from something far worse. A bowl of free salsa that sent hundreds of its own customers to the hospital. In the fall of 2003, a single Chi-Chi's outside Pittsburgh became the source of the largest hepatitis A outbreak in American history. More than 650 people were infected, and 4 of them never came home. You will discover how 2 men with no Mexican cooking background built America's favorite Mexican restaurant, and how a few contaminated green onions destroyed it almost overnight. And by the end, you will learn the cruel detail that makes this collapse even darker, that the company was already bankrupt weeks before the outbreak ever began. It all starts with a former football player and a chimichanga the size of your head. This is the rise and fall of an American institution. How does the most popular Mexican chain in America die from a bowl of salsa? In 1975, the suburbs of Minneapolis were a world of meat and potatoes diners. Mexican food was a foreign concept, a culinary blank space on the Midwestern map, but restaurateur Marno McDermott believed the suburbs were ready for something different. He had already found moderate success with a quick-service Mexican concept called Zapata Foods, but he envisioned something far grander, a massive, festive sit-down restaurant. To fund this gamble, he partnered with an unlikely ally, Max McGee, the former Green Bay Packers wide receiver who had retired to Minnesota to run a local bar. Together, they built a giant 11,000-square-foot dining hall in the suburb of Richfield. Seeking an approachable identity, McDermott named the brand after his wife Arlene's affectionate nickname, Chi-Chi. It was a $2 million bet that suburban families would pay for food they could barely pronounce. When the doors opened in early 1976, the gamble paid off instantly, pulling in $2 million in sales in its first year alone. Yet keeping pace with this overnight sensation required a corporate playbook that neither founder possessed. Inside the Richfield restaurant, the biting Minnesota winter completely vanished. Diners stepped into a sprawling, warm indoor courtyard filled with hanging green ferns, Spanish arches, and bright terracotta tiles. It felt like a Mexican garden oasis, worlds away from the frozen suburban parking lot outside. Chi-Chi's was not merely selling plates of food. It was selling a cheap, vivid escape. Families lined up for hours, lured by the promise of a festive night out. The tables were crowded with baskets of warm, salty tortilla chips and endless bowls of mild red salsa, served the moment guests sat down. The dining room hummed with energy as waiters balanced heavy trays of oversized goblets filled to the brim with frozen margaritas. These massive, colorful drinks turned ordinary suburban dinners into instant celebrations, making a Tuesday night feel like a Friday. The strategy worked spectacularly, pulling in $2 million in sales in that first year alone. Midwesterners embraced this new world of casual dining with an enthusiasm that shocked local competitors, proving the founders' instincts were entirely correct. But managing a single runaway success in Minnesota was one thing. Trying to duplicate this precise sensory magic across the rest of the country was a vastly different gamble. That pressure meant the founders had to find a way to standardize their chaotic kitchen. And that is when they realized they needed to look for outside help to build an empire. Before the kitchen could be streamlined, the food itself had to capture the suburban imagination. The menu was designed for high-impact performance. It introduced millions of diners to an oversized, comforting vision of Mexican food, dominated by the sizzle of hot plates and the smell of toasted corn tortillas. At the center of this spectacle was the chimichanga, a massive, golden-fried burrito that crackled at the touch of a fork, smothered in melted cheese. Combo platters and cheap weekday lunch specials stripped away any culinary intimidation, making the exotic feel comfortably familiar. This was theater on a plate. Weekday lunches and family birthdays became synonymous with giant goblet-sized margaritas, heavy salt rims, and the theatrical arrival of fried ice cream served in a crispy tortilla bowl coated in cinnamon sugar. It was cheap, festive, and entirely unpretentious. For millions of suburban families, these sweet, heavy flavors did not just represent Mexican cuisine, they defined it. Under the hanging ferns and Spanish arches, the brand became a default setting for every celebration. But as the crowds grew larger and the tables stayed full, the pressure to replicate this exact sensory circus across dozens of new territories began to expose the fragile reality of their rapid expansion. Inquiries poured in from desperate investors, including a persistent stockbroker who badgered the founders until they sold him the brand's early franchise rights. But managing this wild, sudden demand required a level of corporate discipline the founders simply did not have. And that is when they turned to Shelley Frank. In 1977, the former Kentucky Fried Chicken executive took the reins as president, immediately relocating the corporate headquarters to the fast food capital of Louisville, Kentucky. Frank brought a cold, mathematical precision to the chaotic Midwestern favorite. He standardized recipes, streamlined kitchen lines, and initiated an aggressive, high-speed expansion program that rapidly pushed the brand far beyond its regional roots. Under Frank's command, new locations opened at an unprecedented, almost breathless pace across North America. This professionalized system transformed the quirky Minnesota experiment into a massive, highly efficient engine, making the entire operation look absolutely unstoppable. But this rapid acceleration also stripped away any margin for error, meaning that even a single operational hiccup would now carry a devastating cost. By the early 1990s, this high-speed expansion engine had conquered suburban America, sprawling into more than 200 locations across 19 states. Supported by a workforce of 7,000 employees, the chain secured the title of America's favorite Mexican restaurant for 8 consecutive years. To millions of families, Chi-Chi's did not merely represent the category, it defined it, establishing itself as the default venue for every high school graduation, birthday, and Tuesday night dinner. Yet this immense cultural dominance made a slow, structural decline incredibly easy to miss. While customers still crowded the booths for sizzling fajitas, changing dining habits and fierce new competition began eroding the chain's financial health from the inside out. The festive atmosphere remained, but the company's margin for error had completely vanished. And that is when two entirely separate crises, one structural on the corporate balance sheets and one invisible in the supply chain, began quietly drawing toward each other. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, the novelty of the suburban Mexican restaurant began to wear thin. The vast, windowless dining rooms that once felt like exotic escapes started to look increasingly dated and dark. Families who used to wait hours for a table under the hanging ferns were now being pulled away by newer, highly polished casual dining concepts. Olive Garden, with its bright Tuscan-themed dining rooms and promise of unlimited soup, salad, and hot breadsticks, became the new default for suburban Sunday dinners. Against this wave of fresh competition, Chi-Chi's food lost its magic. What had once been a thrilling culinary adventure now felt heavy, overprocessed, and generic. The chain quietly stopped building new locations and began shutting underperforming ones, contracting from its peak footprint. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the brand drifted from the absolute center of American family dining toward the quiet margins of suburban strip malls. This loss of customer momentum starved the company of essential cash, which meant the business was completely unprepared for the debt-laden financial engineering that was about to take control of its boardroom. As sales sagged, Chi-Chi's became a corporate hot potato, traded among owners who valued balance sheet manipulation over restaurant operations. The chain eventually landed inside a struggling California-based restaurant group later renamed Prandium. This parent company brought its own baggage, including a history of restructuring and massive debt from a series of leveraged buyouts. Instead of receiving the capital needed to update its dark, dated dining rooms, Chi-Chi's was milked for cash to service Prandium's $100 million liabilities. Financial trouble at the parent level pulled the chain deeper into instability, turning a household name into a shield for corporate survival. The core problem was no longer whether families still wanted chimichangas. The brand was trapped inside a collapsing corporate structure, completely unable to absorb any new economic shock. And that is when the parent company's desperate search for a buyer stalled, leaving the heavily indebted chain balanced on a razor's edge. On October 8, 2003, the corporate shield finally shattered. Chi-Chi's filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, crushed by the debt of its parent company. To secure immediate cash to keep their remaining 123 locations open, executives immediately put the original Richfield, Minnesota flagship up for sale. The very site where Marno McDermott and Max McGee had built their first dining room was now just another line item in a liquidation plan. This filing made it clear that the empire was already on its knees, starved of resources long before the public health crisis began. The outbreak did not create this vulnerability. It merely exposed a system that had already run out of cash and time. The corporate collapse was complete, and that is when the focus shifted from the balance sheet to the plates of food being served to unsuspecting diners in Pennsylvania. At the Beaver Valley Mall in Monaca, Pennsylvania, the daily operations of the local Chi-Chi's continued as they always had. Hungry shoppers settled into the booths, and waiters immediately dropped off the standard complimentary bowls of mild red salsa. It was a simple gesture of hospitality, expected by every guest who walked through the doors. But that free condiment carried an invisible pathogen. Sprinkled over the salsa were finely chopped raw green onions, imported from 3 farms in Mexico. These scallions had bypassed the heat of the kitchen stove, arriving at the tables completely raw. Within those crisp green rings lay the Hepatitis, a virus, waiting to be consumed. What was designed as a harmless token of corporate generosity had transformed into a highly efficient vehicle for infection. Diners dipped their chips, ate their meals, and went home, entirely unaware of the biological clock now ticking inside them. And that is when emergency rooms across Beaver County began to notice a sudden, inexplicable wave of critically ill patients. In late October 2003, emergency rooms in Beaver County, Pennsylvania, filled with people suffering from sudden liver failure, high fevers, and jaundice. Doctors quickly realized this was not a series of isolated illnesses, but a rapidly expanding cluster of acute hepatitis A. The Pennsylvania Department of Health launched an immediate investigation, interviewing dozens of bedridden patients about where they had eaten. Every interview led to the same place, the Chi-Chi's located inside the Beaver Valley Mall in Monaca. On November 4th, as the connection became undeniable, the restaurant voluntarily shut its doors, but the damage was already done. Health officials issued an urgent public advisory, warning anyone who had eaten at the location within the past 14 days to seek immediate medical attention. The virus was no longer a silent contaminant hidden inside bowls of free salsa. It was a full-blown public health emergency. The dining room was empty, but the incubation period for hepatitis A can last up to 50 days, which meant health officials now faced the impossible task of tracking down thousands of exposed diners before they too fell ill. The gymnasium at the local community college quickly transformed into an emergency medical outpost. Day after day, anxious residents queued in lines that stretched out the doors, waiting for a single needle. More than 9,000 people received emergency immune globulin shots, a desperate chemical race against a 50-day incubation clock. But the protective barriers went up too late for hundreds of diners. The total number of sickened passed 650, including 13 Chi-Chi's employees who had unknowingly consumed the same food they served. The disaster quickly crossed state lines as weekend shoppers returned home, cementing this as the largest single-source hepatitis A outbreak in American history. It was no longer a localized food poisoning incident, but a multi-state crisis that threatened to overwhelm regional hospitals, and that is when the focus shifted to the ruined lives of the families who had simply gone out for dinner. 4 diners did not survive the infection. For those who lived, the recovery was grueling. One customer required an emergency liver transplant to survive the organ damage. The crisis quickly transformed from a medical emergency into a massive legal battle. Seattle-based food safety attorney Bill Marler stepped in to represent the victims, demanding that Chi-Chi's identify its suppliers. In a bid to deflect liability, the chain's lawyers attempted to shift the entire blame onto their produce suppliers, but the courts rejected the defense. By July 2004, Marler had secured multi-million-dollar settlements for the victims, including a $6.25 million payout for the transplant recipient. This litigation turned the corporate tragedy into a final financial reckoning, stripping the bankrupt chain of its last remaining defenses. And that is when the cash-strapped company realized it could no longer afford to keep its remaining dining rooms open. Today, those sizzling skillet fajitas survive only in suburban memory. But Chi-Chi's left a sobering warning. It proved that a sprawling empire is only as safe as its weakest supply link, a single, unwashed green onion. In our hyper-connected food system, that quiet fragility remains. Were you part of the Chi-Chi's era? Share your memories in the comments.